Thanks, Natasha, and hi, everyone. Nice to connect, and I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to this series. Again, as we mentioned in the orientation session, we've been working on this for quite a long time at the Tamarack Institute, ever since we started in 2001, and that is, how do we not only help communities mobilize to tackle complex issues like poverty, but how do we think better about them and plan better for them and evaluate and communicate them in a better way. And so this is the latest iteration of our thinking. And our question that drives this whole series is, how might we track and report our impact in reducing local poverty to our stakeholders? So it's a good how might we question. The question might be elegantly simple, but as we'll see, it's not so easy to answer that. So but the why of trying to answer that is really important. And there's often three different reasons why we try and track and measure and communicate our impact. And I'm going to mention the one that is in scope and then confirm that there are two that are out of scope, but still important. And they're out of scope for this series, not for your work, but for this series. The first one is we as innovators and the people we work with, our stakeholders, are desperate for coherence about our work, to make sense of all those millions of little activities and events and milestones and outcomes. We need to paint a picture for ourselves and them, the general progress of our work. So communicating our results, just simply being able to map them in a coherent way, is really quite critical. And that's what we're focused on in this series. If we can do that, we also then set the conditions for another two uses of tracking and measuring impact and outcomes, and that is, number one, strategic learning, getting feedback so we can then say, hey, let's adapt our strategy and continue to move forward. Data is really important. To what extent are we making progress, and what are we learning, and therefore what do we do next? And then above and beyond that, which is even a little bit more complex, is to how do we prove our impact and then help inform strategic choices, such as should we say this is not worth the time and effort and shut it down and try another way, or invest our monies in other strategies. That's the higher level one. These two are important, but we only have so much time in this series, and so we thought we'd work on this foundational one, which was communicating progress. Now, as we do that, we really focused on tracking, reporting, and communicating as well. And the reason we thought that was a good thing to include, and it informed the way we designed the series, and in fact, the reason for including the sixth module, which is communicating, developing a report, is because we think there's generations of communication that represent an evolution of better and better thinking. Number one, the generation that I clearly grew up in, which was dust collecting reports. And that is where we would gather all the data, whatever we had on outcomes and impact, and we would just write up reports for them. And some of you, well, probably all of you, are used to doing that. And I want to confirm that that's actually really important work. Writing a report may not be something that other people read, but it forces us as administrators, innovators, stewards of a change process to be clear about what the heck has happened. So it's a good reflection and monitoring device for us. On the other hand, those things are not that easy to read, and they're not very engaging. So generation two, which I still think we're in the middle of right now, is people using infographics and checklists of accomplishment. And those are much better to look at. They're tighter, better communicated visually. On the other hand, they don't really convey the connections and the evolution of our work over time. It's just simply a list of visually appealing significant moments. And that's better than a dust collecting report, but it's not everything. The third thing we talked about in our orientation session is communicating progress in a change narrative, often using frameworks. And what that does is try and tell a story, almost like an impact story, about how outcomes and impacts and activities accumulate over time for us to see progress. And in a way that we can almost remember them as a story, because people remember stories more than anything, metaphors and stories. This requires a bit more effort to produce, but we think it's well worth the effort, and that's why this whole series is organized around this multiple level framework. And the framework is based on a story. You'll remember the story from the orientation session, the parrot story, saving parrots in St. Lucia. And this story requires us to tell, share, and track and communicate our progress along 3 different key outcomes and a collection of impacts. And so those outcomes, again, are supporting niche innovations, nudging systems and policies, shifting awareness and ownership. We have to do these things concurrently. And as we do that over time, we should see an accumulation of impact, both that, on poverty that is citywide, for targeted groups and areas, and for specific beneficiaries of program services or discrete interventions. So with that in mind, that's a revisiting of the context for this whole session, for the whole series. But before we get into examining outcomes and impacts in each of those areas, we want to talk about foundations of principles to guide your tracking and measuring and communication efforts. And we're using this metaphor again of the paratives. And this, for people who have been involved in evaluation and research before, this might be simply a revisiting of things you know, it's packaged in a slightly different way. For those of you who have never really done this work deeply, some of this stuff might be new. And 12 principles, in some ways, it doesn't even really capture all the things that we have to know to do a good job of measurement, but they do capture the 12, at least 12 of the more important things to know. And as we walk through these, please don't feel the urge to absorb all of these right away. Just feel these principles, because what happens is these principles need to show up over time in each of our data collection efforts. So treat them almost like a checklist of things to consider as you're going about trying to track and communicate outcomes. Now, for those who say, look, principles, forget it, I want methods and indicators, well, I'll invite you to consider going to the betterevaluation.org website, which is the best website, I think, in the English language world on endless methods and indicators. They even have some sections there that are directly related to poverty reduction if you punch that into the search function. But I'll let you know that you're probably going to get lost. It's like going into a very pleasurable jungle. There's so much to see there, and you can spend hours on there and almost get lost simply because of the volume of things. What we want to do is remind you that principles are important. And Brenda Zimmerman, who was a co-author of the book Getting to Maybe and the Best Complexity Teacher I've Ever Met, she had a great phrase once when a response to a question I shared with her in the early 2000s as we were starting up Tamarack. And I said, Brenda, when you're working with people trying to address complex issues, whether it be strategy or design or evaluation, etc., they want tools, they want recipes. No matter what they, no matter what is produced in workshops, generally they say, show me how to do this in a tool or recipe. And she responded with this great phrase that standards or standardized tools and techniques will just get you to the wrong place faster. And instead, what she said is, don't think about recipes, cookie cutter responses, because what will happen is you'll give that to people and it won't be perfect for their context, because context matters a lot. Their own expertise matters a lot. So they will be happy at first blush with the tool and technique, and then they're simply going to get frustrated with it. Instead, let's try and get coherence by framing issues in a way that they're accessible, number one, giving people principles that help their thinking and action across contexts, and offer illustrative practices and examples to say, here's what it could look and feel like. But at the end of the day, the person on the other end has to adapt those principles to their, and frameworks and examples to their context. So that's what we're going to do in this series. We're going to present 12 principles and saying, but the application of these principles is context sensitive, and that is the work that you have to do. And that is the work we always have to do. So here are the 12 principles in brief, and then I'm going to go into them in each detail, and then we'll open it up for questions. Number one, be clear about the purpose of tracking and measuring. 2, accept the imperfection of poverty measures. 3, align measurement efforts to your plan. Even then, we need to prioritize what to measure because there's so much we could measure. Number 5, many of you will like this, when we consider the phrase measurement, we actually are cheating a little bit because it's really hard to measure everything quantifiably. We actually are probably better served by this principle of no numbers without narratives and no narratives without numbers. Number 6, as we'll see, that what we're doing is, in order to get a sense of outcomes, we're often weaving a patchwork of data together to create a coherent story. It's like a crime scene. You just get little pieces of information. Number 7, this is really critical for many of you, match methods and indicators to your capacity. If you've got a lot of capacity, you can do sophisticated things. If you have very little capacity, you're not going to get really sophisticated measurements and feedbacks. You're going to have to do what you can. Number 8, adapt, adopt, or build your own measurement methods. You have 3 choices whenever you see a measurement challenge, and those are the 3. We'll go into those. Number 9, don't try and prove that you caused an outcome. That will make sense when we go over it. Number 11, make appropriate claims about your impacts. Don't overclaim, because people will start doubting your story. And number 12, get ready to learn by doing, because this stuff requires relentless practice. Almost no one starts off doing this really good, but we get better over time. When we did Vibrant Communities for 10 years, the first 2 years we were extraordinarily clumsy across the 15 communities involved in the network. And by year 10, we were really quite sophisticated, not across the board, but you could really see how the entire network had dramatically improved its capacity to track and communicate results. So let's get into these. And principle number 1 is to be clear about the purpose of your measurement effort. So I've added another reason to track and measure stuff. There, in addition to the ones we looked at before, tracking communication, strategic learning, and strategic choices, there's also field building. That's another reason to track and communicate your outcome, but that's a different purpose. Field building is where someone comes to you and says, hey, we're trying to learn about how to reduce homelessness in communities, and we've got this national study, and we need to track and understand your work and outcomes for the broader purpose of saying something about the entire field. Well, for our purposes here on this session, we are talking simply about tracking outcomes for the purpose of communication. So when people ask you about why you're tracking outcomes, you're probably going to have to make a choice here, and it's got implications for what you do. So for what you track. So if you're saying you were here to prove, judge the merit or worth, or a judge make a high stakes decision about your intervention, you better have really robust data. You possibly will need an external evaluator, and you're going to for sure need pretty good expertise to be able to do that, because these are high stakes decisions. If you're saying, look, I'm just simply tracking what's going on, so you have a general sense of what's going on, you probably just require roughly right data that is easy to gather, analyze, and communicate. So number 1, really be clear about what this is and what this isn't when you're doing this tracking. Number 2, this is a really big one. And you know, I didn't think we'd be saying the same thing. Literally, when did we start Vibrant Communities? 2001. So almost 20 years ago. This principle, I wish we would have seen it back then, because we didn't believe it. And that is to accept the imperfection of poverty impact measures. Poverty is a very complex, highly debated, even contested experience that defies simple measurement. So here's just a sample of things from the web from last year. Human Development Index, people are working on that. People are talking about new poverty measures. Bill Gates tweets out a chart about poverty, and people jump on it pretty quickly because they don't like the thinking behind the measurement system. This is a contested field, everybody. And why is it contested? Well, number 1, because poverty is a constellation of causes and effects. And so I'm going to read this quote. Every problem in poverty magnifies the impact of the others, and all are so tightly interlocked that one reversal can produce a chain reaction with results far distant from the original causes. A rundown apartment can exacerbate a child's asthma, which leads to a call for an ambulance, which generates a medical bill that cannot be paid, which ruins a credit record, which hikes the interest rate on a loan, which forces the purchase of an unreliable used car, which jeopardizes the mother's punctuality at work, which limits her promotions and earning capacity, which confines her to poor housing. So there's something, even though this woman's experience, this mother's experience is very unique, there is a universal experience here, which is the interconnectivity of all of these things. And this woman is clearly, possibly on a downward spiral where one reversal creates another reversal. And of course, poverty reduction, in a way, is trying to create an upward spiral where one strength leads to the next strength, sort of they call it a beneficent spiral. So we're really trying to do that. Now, look at the complexity for this one person. How would we measure this for one person? Never mind doing it for entire communities. So when we talk about defining and measuring poverty, here's what we're dealing with. Multiple dimensions, top left corner. Different types of poverty. Some of you may have used the poverty matrix that we created a long time ago, well over 20 years ago, that says homeless poverty is different than being temporarily unemployed, is different than being working poor, that is different than being at risk of poverty. Demographics, seniors and youth. Homeless youth in Victoria's poverty is different than a senior living on a fixed income in Peterborough, or a working poor new Canadian who's got a degree from a foreign university that's not recognized or credentialized in Canada. So we know that. Geography makes the difference. Northern Newfoundland versus downtown Vancouver. Ethnocultural worldview. There's different worldviews on what poverty looks like. Even some people don't like using the term. And finally, there's political and personal opinions. If you look at even the debates between the Fraser Institute and the Canadian Council on Social Development, I think it's still around, but when they were there, they would have fierce debates about what's the right poverty line. So folks, this is a crazy constellation of things. And when you look at how people have tried to resolve them, there is a lot of different intervention level measurement frameworks. And what we mean by intervention level is you develop a program or a service or a policy, you intervene, and then you want to see the splatter of effects that occur from that, just from the intervention. Well, let's look at a couple of them. There are self-sufficiency scales. These are really big in the United States, but they use them in poverty reduction efforts, where they look at 8 or 10 domains of poverty. Let's pretend it's that single mother story that we just looked at. They go, well, here's credit and transportation and housing, etc. And they assign levels from 1 to 5 about a journey out of poverty, and they track people's journey using that self-sufficiency scale. There's deprivation indices. There's the sustainable livelihoods framework, which I happen to love. There's social development as determinants of health. So that's just at the intervention level. At the population level, you'll see some of these repeated. There's also things that are already out there. There's lots of income-based measures, MDM, LICO, LIM, and many of you were on the call not long ago with HRSDC around the new poverty dashboard, and there's lots of debates about what's the right line and can you collect it and can you disaggregate it at the local level. There's deprivation indices again, the dashboard that we just talked about, and there's also the Canadian Index of Wellbeing. So lots of expressions of how to track this at the population level framework. Well, here's what it means, everyone. Rather than search for the perfect and universal framework, almost all of you at the local effort are going to have to make do with imperfect measures and come up with a working definition of poverty. Working definition and measurement of poverty. Say, here's what poverty we think it means, and here's the imperfect way that we measure progress at whatever level. And Hamilton's really led the way. Well, Hamilton led the way in a lot of ways, but in the way they dealt with this, their working definition of poverty was based on reality. They have a comprehensive approach to poverty, but they used income poverty as a blunt proxy, including the LICO. And one roundtable member said, poverty is much, much more than a lack of income, but it always includes a lack of income. So that is their blunt proxy. So accept the imperfection, call it a working definition, and then deal with real imperfect measures as blunt proxies for progress. That's a big one. That principle took the most time, but it's the most important to get our head around. Number 3, this one's kind of obvious. Align measurement efforts to your plan. Listen, the next 2 principles deal with that. There is a million things to measure in the work, and measurement in general is difficult. So if you're going to choose something, create a results framework that of course is based around your plan. And I've seen a lot of your plans. Many of you use the framework of pillars or pathways or priorities. Whatever it is, you've made a case that employment or housing or income or education, early childhood development is important. That's what you measure. Align it to your plan. So you have overall poverty reduction, and then you've got these pathways or pillars or priorities to get there. Please organize around that. So example number 1, End Poverty Edmonton. I'm actually not sure that they organize their work this way, but this would be the implication of that principle. They've actually got 6 game changers. They say, if we change these things, if we make transformational change, we think we'll see a disproportionate reduction in poverty in Edmonton. So number 1, eliminate racism. 2, increase income so that they're livable. Affordable housing, transit, of course, childcare, and access to mental health services. And the reason they think this may not be universally relevant to everyone, but a critical mass of Edmontonians experience this in some form or another. And they think if they can get this, they'll get a critical mass of support a critical mass of Edmontonians working working in the right direction. And underneath those, they have 28 priority areas. So pretty simple. Talk about poverty, but align the results around your priorities or pathways. Number 2, even when you do that, you can't measure everything, folks. It's impossible. So we need to prioritize our measurement. What are the impacts that we want to track, that we must track, and which ones would you like to track if you had the time and expertise, and why, and separate those. Our like list is generally way, way bigger than our need list or want list. Number 5, I love this one. This one, I'm going to try a slightly different way of getting the point across. Most things can't be understood by using qualitative or quantitative indicators and methods alone. We need mixed methods. We need we need a collection of both. And the principle is no numbers without narratives and no narratives without numbers. So let me give you a quick example of that. The Mona Lisa is a world famous painting, and there is some interesting quantitative information that reveals something about that painting. It's really old, 517 years. Its size is 77 centimeters and 53 centimeters. That should be centimeters, not millimeters. It weighs 8.2 kilos. It averages 30,000 visitors a day, and it's an estimated worth of 650 to 820 million US dollars. Now, so that says something. That 30,000 a day and 650 says something, and the age says something, but it doesn't reveal everything. It doesn't actually, it offers us trends and patterns and depth, but it doesn't, like quantitative information can, offer what qualitative information can: context, nuance, interpretation, and meaning. So why is, let's do some qualitative stuff here. Why is this important? Well, this painting is a Renaissance innovation. It had pioneered the sfumato technique, which is a smoky quality with shaded light. It's got a 3/4 pose, which was relatively new at that time. They used to do full body pictures. It's got this weird 3D perspective, and it really exemplifies the Renaissance preoccupation with ratios and symmetry. So this is a classic Renaissance painting. It also has masterful brushstrokes. We know it was Da Vinci who created this. And the eyes follow you. The smile is mysterious, and we don't know who this person is. There's some people who think they know, and there's other people who said that's not this person at all. And there's a deeper political statement here. And finally, the celebrity of this whole thing was enhanced by the fact that it's Leonardo's painting, and he was already famous. So he's kind of like a Kardashian in a way that they're famous just for being famous, although the difference was Leonardo had all of these amazing capabilities. It was actually robbed from the museum in 1911, which really enhanced people's fame of that painting. And it's placed in one of the most well-known museums in the world and one of the best places in the world. So it's going to see a lot of visitors. So see this sort of, it's almost two-eyed seeing in a way. We need the qualitative and the quantitative together to get a fulsome understanding about the significance of this product. Well, we also need that when it comes to the significance of our development programs. And I'm going to give you a little example taken from a technique called most significant change. And a colleague, Jess Dart, told me the story about doing an evaluation of a rural development program in Indonesia, which had a strong gender component. And she got some quantitative information from a senior, an elder woman who was participating in that. And the elder woman said, look, here's what's happening. I attend a rural council meeting, 3 of them on Fridays, except holidays. I got to walk 10 miles to and from this thing. And when I go there, I don't say anything. Like there's no data there about, increase or decrease in saying things. The qualitative information came when Jess asked the 2 questions. She said, what's the significance of this? Again, context, nuance, interpretation. And the elder answered, in the history of our village, no woman has ever been allowed to attend that meeting. Now, because of this program, we can. Number one. And then she said, so if you were to give this a newspaper headline, what would you call it? And she said, the headline would be, I've had enough. Next time I'm going to say some things. And so are my colleagues. So, boy, what a powerful expression, a powerful vignette. And I guess goosebumps just telling you that. When you look at really good evaluations, everyone, and people are particularly communicating progress, they're always using mixed methods. Almost always. The statistics like infographics are just like the Leonardo da Vinci, the Mona Lisa with some stats. They suggest something, but they don't tell you much. So the best presentation I ever saw, I was just starting, I did some work with the UN, and I went to a conference where someone introduced the life of the Jimenez family, pre-agricultural reforms. And they said, here's what happens in the morning, and they got to get up at 5 to go get water, and the kids can't really go to school until after at lunch, and therefore they only get a partial education, etc. Then they talked about all the things they did with this agricultural policy reform, and they had lots of statistics on that. And then they said, and then after, here's what's changed for the Jimenez family. Hey, they don't have to get up at 5 now, they can get up at 7 because the water supply is close to their house. And because of this program, the kids can go to school all day, etc. This really showed both the qualitative and quantitative dimensions of their improvements. Another great case study that's still around, if you Google a little bit, was Poverty Reduction Initiative for Persons Living Institutionalized Care who participated in social enterprise. So what happened is they would participate in a part-time enterprise, selling pizzas, couriers, etc. And the follow-up study was really interesting because they categorized the outcomes into 3 different stories: fulfilled expectations, partially fulfilled expectations, and unfulfilled expectations. And what they did was they asked people to just to describe what their life was like. And fulfilled expectations said, I like going to work, the money helps me out that I get, I got out of social assistance, I made friends. It's a pretty good story. And by the way, half of them were above the low-income cutoff line. Partially fulfilled stories, I like the work relationships, but I get stressed at times. The money's good, but it's not enough to pay my bills. And the unfulfilled expectations were people who went through that program and things were worse off for them. I made enough money to leave social assistance, but left me without my drug benefits, etc. I'm worse off than I was. So again, you could throw a LICO stat out there and saying, here's the emphasis of the program, but it hardly captures what's truly happening. That is a big principle, folks. The other ones are a little more manageable, but we've just gone through 2 big ones: accept the imperfection of poverty measures, number 1, and number 2, when we're tracking progress, no narratives without numbers, no numbers without narratives. So let's go on to the last ones. Principle 6, weave together a patchwork of data to create a coherent impact story. This is, again, another one I wish we would have had in 2001. When you are convening or coordinating a poverty reduction effort, like most of you are, and some of you might use the word round tables, I think you use it quite a bit, you've actually got at least 3 different archetypical stances that you have vis-a-vis the interventions that you're trying to track. So sometimes you have a lot of control. You have interventions that you build and drive. Your round table is the one that conceives of them, stewards them, manages them, and reports on them. They are yours. You build and drive them. You have a lot of control. On the other hand, you have a lot of interventions that are part of a larger framework, but your round table actually has very little to do with them, but they're clearly aligned with your poverty reduction strategy. They might have been a little bit inspired and nudged by, but they're kind of stamping brands. You'd say, we love that program. It's related to the poverty reduction strategy. We think they're great. Now, that's pretty good. You want a lot of those, but here's the challenge. You don't control much. They don't owe you anything for data. It's you don't have in-house data, and you are almost begging to get some kind of data from them. Then there's a lot of support and amplifies. Roundtables and strategies have initiatives that get some kind of support. You collaborate in this intervention, and you can therefore influence the methods of data and probably get a little bit more. But again, you're not the boss of them. You don't own it, so you can't assume that you can collect all the data that you like. This is the situation that most of you find yourself in. So when you're trying to tell stories about tracking and communicating your progress over time, you're weaving together whatever you can. Build and drive, you probably have more data. Stamp and brands and support and amplify, you're getting whatever data you can. This is the reality of your work. So here's a little example in Waterloo Opportunities 2000 initiative. A group not long ago had a poverty reduction fund where they, on behalf of the federal government, this was in 1998, I think, administered this fund. So they had tremendously good data on all the nonprofits who got, I think there was 27 different projects, money from this fund. So good data. They said, here's the money, here's the collection instruments on poverty reduction that you need to use. On the other hand, they also had a program that had businesses whose job was to improve their employment practices to reduce poverty, including improving rates, benefits, offering childcare and transportation, etc. There was a book called 10 Things Your Businesses Can Do to Reduce Poverty. Now, we launched that, I was there at the time with the Chambers of Commerce, but we sent that to businesses and they didn't owe us any information. So we actually couldn't even use the instruments that we used for the Poverty Reduction Fund to track their outcomes. So when we pulled together our data, we had really good data on the Social Investment Fund, Poverty Reduction Fund outcomes, and we had extraordinarily spotty, mostly vignette level data from the business progressive HR practice funds, including stories of people who increased payment rates by 20–30% when they found out what the low-income cutoff rate. So here's the challenge. We rarely can get consistent feedback on data. What we're looking for is coherent stories and coherent feedback. Principle number 7, match methods to your capacity. We know that some of you are larger groups and have more capacity, and some of you are really smaller groups and just trying to get stuff done off the side of your desk, or have volunteers or part-time coordinators who are doing everything. So we think that you probably have different levels of capabilities to gather data. And so we think you should be serious about that and be upfront when you're communicating with your stakeholders about your own capacity to accumulate data. So if you have very little capacity, you're probably saying, here's what's going on, here's why we're doing this poverty reduction fund, here's why we're shooting for this policy, here's what the evidence says already would be good. If we could improve this, we should see those outcomes. And we think we probably will see some, here's the kind of key activities and outputs we see, and we think we'll probably see plausibly some outcomes that impact, but you don't claim a lot. Level 3, on the other hand, you may have a lot of ability to use new data and more sophisticated forms of analysis. You might even have diverse evaluation teams. You probably at one point can say, based on the evidence we have, we think these are the probable outcomes that impact from our work. And finally, level 2 is right up in the middle there. I won't read it for you. It makes a lot of sense when you look at it. You might be able to accumulate enough evidence with the capacity you have to point to likely outcomes that impact. Matching methods to capacity. So this is all hypothetical, but there's lots of groups who do poverty simulations, where I think you know what that means. You have, in order to improve the awareness of the public and key policymakers about what it's like to live in poverty, to generate insight and empathy, you run a simulation session in an evening where people have to experience what it's like to live in poverty, and there's little games and role playing that you work, and apparently they're quite popular. Let's say you had a level 1 capacity, you have almost no capability to do this. You might say, here's why we did the poverty simulation, get people aware of what poverty was like. Here's the number of people we had, and here's what we probably expect in terms of follow-up income behaviors after they go through that, because the research is out there and it says that 30% of people might actually take action after that. We can't prove that, but this is plausible. You had a lot of capacity, you actually might, or sort of medium capacity, you might actually do some follow-up interview with participants and said, here's what's changed for them and here's whether or not they're doing anything based on that experience. If you had a lot of capacity, you might do the same things that level 1 and 2 did, but you might follow people for 2 years and talk about how their perceptions have changed. And again, ask even more thoroughly, what have you done with that changed awareness in terms of action? So you get the idea. We're really giving you permission to, if you don't have a lot of capacity, don't pretend you're level 3, but do a good job on level 1. Principle number 8. I like this. This is really not a principle. This really lays out your choices, but I like this because it simplifies the world. When you see something that you want to track, and again, every tracking and measurement story is unique, you have 3 options in front of you. You can adopt an existing set of methods and indicators and data. You can adopt and adapt one, saying that's how people do it, but we're going to adapt it to our context. Or number 3, you could say there's nothing out there that fits our build. We have to build it from scratch. Now, each of these have pros and cons. Of course, if you adopt something from somewhere else, it might have been refined and it might have credibility. And you may not even need that deep expertise because it's got a little toolkit with it. Well, that's good. The downside is it may be so recipe'd up that it may not reflect your unique need and it may not even exist. The build, obviously, the great thing for doing something build is you can customize it entirely to your local situation, and it could be fit like a glove. On the other hand, you actually need expertise to develop instruments. And if you haven't done it, you're not going to be good at it. You're going to need people who know how to develop and test instruments, or be okay with kind of scrappy instruments that you build on your own, but you're going to have to learn how to do it. There is no cookie cutter for you. You have to learn on your own. Adapting is somewhere in the middle, where you'd say, I really like how they, all the instruments for follow-up on those poverty simulations, I've seen them, but we're going to adapt because we don't want it to be as long, we want it to work in different languages, et cetera, et cetera. You at least start with something, but you tinker with it in a way that it gets reflected in your local context. You can already tell by the way I frame that, I love adopting and adapting because it's easier to look at what has been done before and then saying, okay, half my learning curve is completed. I just need to spend a little bit of time of customizing it to my content. So I'm going to give you an example of this. Here's a great example of building a system. Calgary's Homelessness Management Information System. Calgary is like, I think, got one of the most sophisticated 10-year plans to end homeless in the country for a whole bunch of reasons. And they had to build from scratch their own management information system. And it cost millions of bucks and a lot of time and a lot of friction with people, but they felt they needed to build something from scratch. I'm going to give you another example of something a lot less intense. And this is from a story I heard of an evaluator from the cod fishery in Newfoundland, where they used a mix of all 3 different methods. Where they got data, existing data from the federal government on the cod fishery, so they had scientists add to that. But they also created their own, built from scratch, their own little technique, where what they would do is they would ask fishermen in this one region to share their catch and release time. And what that meant, and I might get this wrong, but I'll get the general idea right, is when people come in from fishing, they often would report how long it took to catch their ceiling of fish for personal consumption, right? And so when cod fisheries were great, they might say, my catch and release time was like 1 hour. I caught all my personal consumption within an hour. When cod fisheries are low, or my 10 minutes. When cod fisheries were bad, they'd say, it took me 8 hours to finally get my personal consumption limit. And so that was a real customized local stat, and they simply asked people to report that as they came in to the port, and they collected over time these sort of scrappy little catch and release stats to complement the stats given to them by Department of Fisheries. 3 more principles, everyone. I hope that one makes sense. This one is one of those ones that I think might be transformational for people, and this is about estimating contribution rather than proving attribution. So when you see an outcome or an impact that emerges from your local poverty reduction efforts, sooner or later, and it usually happens sooner, people say, hey, how do I know that your intervention, your activities caused that change? Well, attribution says, let's assume there's a linear relationship between my actions and that outcome. And attribution says, to what degree did we cause that? And attribution seeks to prove that we caused it. And attribution privileges experimental design like randomized controlled trials, which we can't do for the most part, to prove that. Contribution on the right-hand side says, forget it, let's embrace a wide-angle lens that says there's lots of reasons that change happened, not just us. So we are one of many factors. It says it right up from the beginning. So let's ask, To what degree did our intervention contribute to the change alongside many others? Let's try and get a plausible understanding about the extent to which we contributed to this, and we'll use whatever methods we need to make that case. So we're going to talk about that in, a couple times in the next modules around awareness and systems change, etc. But this is a paradigm shift of the highest order that has some real practical application implications. But this principle, I think you really should take to heart because it's going to save you a lot of grief in the future. I'm not going to give you examples of this because we're going to go over those in the next webinars. Last three principles, and they're fairly straightforward. When you get outcomes, let's say even if you get good qualitative and quantitative data on something that has changed, we actually have to still judge them. And you may or may not want to judge things when you're communicating efforts, but who knows if 37 new childcare spaces in a neighborhood is good? Who knows if improving high school, turning the curve on high school dropout rates. It used to be 5% increase a year, and now we flatlined at 0, and now we're trying to get it to high school graduation rates to increase. Who knows if that's good or not? It's just a change. So what we often need to do, and you may not need to do in your communication, but there is the act of evaluation, and it's in the title there. Look under Principle 10. Evaluation. How do we value change? And there's really 5 ways of doing this, and I'll leave this to you to determine which way works best for you, if at all. Number 1 is to say, did they show change? Did they get better? Number 1. Number 2, things may have changed, they've gotten better, but did we achieve some kind of target that we set out in advance? Oh, we got 37 new childcare spaces, but we wanted 100. See the difference there? 37 is an improvement, 100 compares against the goal. Benchmarking says, how is your work going on against someone else? Hey, St. John got 37 new seats, but Moncton, somehow they've got 200 new childcare seats, while Fredericton actually lost some. You benchmark against others. Great thing about benchmarking is you get out of your own head, your own shell. On the other hand, it's often like comparing apples and oranges. Number 4, you could use standards. How does our progress, that shouldn't be against peers, that should see, how does our progress compare against some standards? And finally, the biggest one, perspectives. How do diverse stakeholders value the change? Sometimes there is, when someone looks at something, whether it's successful or not, or good or not, depends on your perspective. And so what you do is you simply ask a lot of people, what do you think of this change? Some people say, hey, 37 new seats is great. Someone says, oh, I don't mind those 37 new seats, but we had to close down that other center to get it, so I'm not very happy about it. You can see where I'm going with this. Stakeholders, you have diverse perspectives, and you simply say, there is no obvious good or bad. Let's simply get diverse opinions on that. We're going to see this in some of the later modules. The last 2 are pretty straightforward. Principle 11, make appropriate claims about your impact. We talked about this earlier on. Whenever you're communicating things, people are used to marketing efforts. And in fact, there's research done that shows if someone thinks you're marketing something, they get defensive and they might even tune you out. So when we're communicating efforts, we should try, and obviously people want to show a positive story, but it's really important not to overclaim what you think is happening. So if you have different levels of impact, or have you deployed different levels of sophistication in tracking and communicating impact, be really clear about what you're saying. Saying, based on the data we have, here is what we think are plausible impacts, or likely impacts, or probable impacts. Don't overclaim, because people will sniff that out pretty quickly. And in the last module, module 6, we have some wording that you might use as a disclaimer when you communicate your report that I've already seen some other groups use. So really important. And the last one, folks, those are 11 principles. Some of you might be overwhelmed. Although when we did some follow-up to the first group who did this work, they said that these principles began to make a lot of sense over time and were a really useful checklist as they, every time they wanted to go track and communicate something. The only way to get good at this is to do it. So we have workbooks and coaches and webinars to support you. Once you start doing it and trying to track and communicate one little story, trying to track and communicate the progress of an entire year. You will get better by learning by doing, and it's through relentless iteration that you will build success. So the only thing for you to do is to start, try stuff, use the checklist, use the tools and resources, and the next iteration get better, and then the third iteration get even better again. Those are our 12 principles, everyone. You will have lots of questions about them, and so what I'm going to do is turn this over now to Natasha, and she can kickstart the next part of this webinar.